The city of Mogadishu sits on the edge of the Indian Ocean like a broken tooth, whitewashed buildings pocked with bullet holes, streets choked with sand and spent brass, the air thick with diesel smoke and the salt tang of the sea. By the autumn of 1993, the capital had become a labyrinth of warlord territories, each district a sovereign kingdom ruled by clan militias and technicals, pickup trucks welded with heavy machine guns. The international community called it a humanitarian intervention. The men on the ground called it something else. Operation Gothic Serpent had been running since late August. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, had deployed Task Force Ranger to Mogadishu with a singular mandate: capture or kill the leadership of the Haber Gitter clan, specifically General Mohammed Farah Aidid, the warlord whose forces had ambushed and killed 24 Pakistani peacekeepers that June. The task force was a composite unit drawn from the best America could field: operators from Delta Force, the 75th Ranger Regiment, the 165th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, along with Air Force Pararescue and Navy SEALs. 160 men rotating through a hangar at the Mogadishu airport, living on MRES and bottled water, sleeping in cots between missions that came down from command like clockwork. The heat in Mogadishu during October is relentless. The sun climbs white and merciless over the city, baking the corrugated metal roofs until they shimmer, turning the sand-colored streets into radiant grids of glare. Temperatures hover around 98 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside the fuselage of a UH-60 Blackhawk, surrounded by fuel tanks and ammunition crates and the body heat of a dozen Rangers in full kit, it feels closer to 110. The men wore desert camouflage, Kevlar helmets, body armor loaded with magazine pouches, grenades, smoke canisters, and water. They carried M16A2 rifles, some with M203 grenade launchers slung beneath the barrel. The loadout was standard for close-quarters combat in an urban environment: overwhelming firepower, minimal comfort. But Mogadishu was never just a tactical problem. It was a place where history folded over itself, where the modern world collided with something older, something that didn't appear in the mission briefs or intelligence summaries. The Somali people have lived along this coast for over 2,000 years, their culture shaped by trade with Arabia, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. Islam arrived early, taking root in the 7th century, and with it came a cosmology that acknowledged more than the material world. Jinn, spirits of smokeless fire, were spoken of as casually as the weather. The dead were treated with a reverence that bordered on ritual care. Bodies washed, wrapped, buried before sundown. The Somalis believed that disturbing the dead, showing disrespect to a corpse, invited catastrophe. Not metaphorical catastrophe. Real, tangible retribution from forces that lived just beyond the threshold of perception. The elders in Bakara market had been whispering for weeks before October 3rd. They said the spirits were restless. They said the fighting had angered something beneath the city, something that had been sleeping in the old wells and the tombs near the coast. They called them Mala'ikatu al-Sauda, the Black Angels. Not angels in the Western sense, not beings of light and mercy, but emissaries of reckoning, creatures that appeared when the balance between the living and the dead had been violated. They were described in fragments, never directly: figures that moved without sound, shadows that stood upright, presences that made the air go cold even under the equatorial sun. The market women refused to sell meat after dark. The children stopped playing in certain alleys, and the militiamen, hardened fighters who had survived years of civil war, began carrying small pouches of salt and verses from the Quran written on scraps of paper, tucked into their ammunition belts. No one in Task Force Ranger knew this. The cultural briefings had covered clan dynamics, weapon capabilities, likely ambush points. There had been no discussion of folklore, no anthropological context for the fear that was beginning to settle over the district like a weather system. To the Americans, Mogadishu was a target deck, a series of grids and coordinates, buildings color-coded by threat level. The supernatural was not a variable in their calculus. On the morning of October 3rd, the intelligence came in clean. IDID's lieutenants were meeting in a building near the Olympic Hotel, a three-story structure on Hallwadig Road, deep in the heart of Haber Gitter territory. The mission was straightforward. Fast rope Delta operators onto the target building, secure the individuals, extract them via ground convoy, while the Rangers established a perimeter. Estimated time, 30 minutes. The plan had been executed 6 times before, without significant resistance. There was no reason to believe this time would be different. The helicopters lifted off from the airfield at 15:32 hours. 16 aircraft in total. 8 Black Hawks carrying the assault and blocking forces, 4 MH-6 Little Birds for command and control, and 4 AH-6 Little Birds armed with miniguns and rockets. They flew low over the city, rotor wash kicking up dust and trash from the streets below, the sound of the engines a deep, percussive thrum that echoed off the concrete and stone. From the open doors of the Blackhawks, the city unfolded in shades of ochre and gray, a warren of narrow streets and open courtyards, laundry strung between buildings, the occasional technical racing along a boulevard, militiamen firing AK-47s into the air in defiance or celebration. It was hard to tell which, but as the helicopters crossed into Bakara Market, the radio chatter began to change. Pilots reported unusual radio interference, brief bursts of static that didn't correspond to any known jamming frequency. The air temperature, measured by onboard sensors, dropped 7 degrees Fahrenheit in under a minute, a phenomenon that made no meteorological sense given the clear skies and full sun. And then there were the birds. Hundreds of them, crows and kites rising from the rooftops in a single black cloud, circling the helicopters in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost coordinated. The Night Stalker pilots had flown in worse conditions, through worse distractions, but more than one of them would later report a feeling, something they couldn't articulate in the after-action debriefs. A sense that they were being watched, not by the militiamen below, but by something else, something that had been waiting for them. At 15:42 hours, the first chalk of Delta operators fast-roped onto the target building. The mission clock started. 30 minutes, in and out. Routine. But routine was about to become a word no one would use again. The target building rose 3 stories above Hallwadig Road, its facade pitted with shrapnel scars from previous firefights, windows covered with sheets of corrugated metal or simply left empty, dark squares that stared out over the street like hollow eyes. The structure had once been a hotel or office building, back when Mogadishu had a functioning government and commerce that didn't involve weapons or caught. Now it was just another warren in the marketplace, indistinguishable from 100 others, except for the intelligence that placed IDID's men inside. The Delta operators moved with the efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times before. Staff Sergeant Matt Eversman's Ranger Chalk had already established the outer perimeter on the street below, taking positions behind walls and in doorways. M16S trained on the alleyways that fed into the intersection. The ground convoy was inbound. 4 5-ton trucks and 3 Humvees threading through the narrow streets from the airfield, carrying the cargo nets and flex cuffs needed to transport prisoners. The Little Birds orbited overhead, their miniguns tracking movement on the rooftops, their presence a constant reminder to anyone below that the sky belonged to the Americans. Inside the target building, the assault team stacked on the first door. 12 men in tan desert camouflage and black body armor, faces obscured by balaclavas and tinted goggles, each one carrying between 60 and 80 pounds of equipment. Their weapons were customized, shortened M4 carbines with reflex sights, suppressors on some, visible lasers on others, configured for the kind of close-quarters work where hesitation measured in fractions of a second could be fatal. The point man carried a Remington 870 breaching shotgun loaded with Hatton rounds, solid slugs designed to blow door hinges and locks without sending shrapnel into the room beyond. The temperature inside the building was noticeably cooler than the street. Not comfortable, but different. A kind of stillness that felt wrong given the chaos outside, the rotors overhead, the shouting in Somali that was beginning to echo from the surrounding blocks as the word spread that the Americans were on the ground. One of the operators, a master sergeant whose name would later be redacted from all official reports, keyed his radio and reported the temperature drop to the command bird circling at 1,500 feet. The response was brief, professional, uninterested. Copy. Continue mission. The door came off its hinges with a crack like a rifle shot. The team flowed through the breach in a practiced sequence, high-low coverage, overlapping sectors of fire, flashlights cutting through the dust and dimness. The first room was empty. Bare concrete floor, walls stained with mildew, a single wooden chair lying on its side in the corner. They moved to the next room. Empty. And the next. The building felt abandoned, but the intelligence had been adamant. 6 to 8 high-value targets, meeting in progress, window of opportunity closing fast. They reached the stairwell. Concrete steps, narrow and uneven, climbing into shadows that the flashlights couldn't quite penetrate. The point man started up, weapon raised, moving in a half-crouch, each footfall deliberate and silent. The rest of the team followed, maintaining interval, their breathing controlled despite the adrenaline, despite the weight of the gear, and the 100-degree heat that clung to them like a second skin even here, in this cool, quiet place that smelled faintly of something the operators couldn't immediately identify. Not rot, not decay exactly, but something older. Incense, maybe, or burnt hair. On the second floor, they found the first body. He was lying face down in the hallway, dressed in a white makawis and sandals, his hands positioned as if he had been reaching for something when he died. There was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of trauma. The Delta medic knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers against the carotid artery, held for 5 seconds, then looked up and shook his head. Dead, but the body was still warm. The skin temperature registered 94 degrees Fahrenheit when the medic checked with a digital thermometer. Too warm for someone who had been dead long enough to account for the rigor that was already setting in around the jaw and fingers. The team leader made a hand signal. Continue. They moved past the body, sweeping the rooms on the second floor, and found 3 more. All men, all dressed in civilian clothes, all lying in positions that suggested sudden collapse rather than violence. No shell casings, no bullet impacts, no blast residue. One of them was still holding a glass of tea, the liquid inside it cold to the touch despite the ambient temperature. Another had a Quran open on his lap, turned to a passage that none of the operators could read, but which would later be identified as Surah 72. Al-Jinn, the chapter concerning spirits and unseen beings. The radio crackled. Command bird to assault team. What's your status? Do you have the targets? The team leader responded, his voice flat, professional, giving nothing away. Negative on live targets. Multiple deceased, no signs of struggle. Proceeding to 3rd floor. There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that lasted just long enough to register as uncertainty. Then copy. Continue sweep. Ground convoy is 3 minutes out. The stairwell to the 3rd floor was narrower than the others, the walls closing in as if the building itself was contracting. The air here was colder still, cold enough that the operator's breath began to fog, visible in the beam of the flashlights. One of them, a younger sergeant on his first deployment with Delta, muttered something under his breath. Not quite a prayer, not quite a curse. The operator behind him told him to shut up and keep moving. The 3rd floor was a single large room, open except for the support pillars that ran down the center. The ceiling was low, corrugated metal patched with tar paper. the walls lined with windows that had been bricked up from the inside, blocking out all natural light. In the center of the room, arranged in a rough circle, were 6 more bodies. They were seated upright, legs crossed, hands resting on their knees, heads bowed as if in prayer or meditation. The same white clothing, the same lack of visible trauma. But their eyes were open, and in the beam of the flashlights, those eyes reflected back a dull, flat sheen, like the eyes of fish left too long on ice. The team spread out, covering the room, checking for threats, for hidden doors, for anything that might explain what they were seeing. There was nothing. No weapons, no documents, no radio equipment. Just the bodies and the cold, and a smell that was growing stronger now, unmistakable. Burnt metal and ozone, the smell that comes after a lightning strike. One of the operators approached the nearest body, reached out to check for a pulse, even though it was obvious there wouldn't be one. And as his gloved hand made contact with the man's shoulder, the body fell forward, collapsing like a marionette with cut strings. The skin beneath the white fabric was gray, desiccated, as if all the moisture had been pulled out of it. The operator jerked his hand back, took a step away, and said the first thing that came to mind. What the fuck did this? No one answered, because no one had an answer. The ground convoy reached the target building at 15:49 hours, 7 minutes after the Delta operators had entered. The Rangers dismounted from the 5-ton trucks with practiced speed, establishing additional security positions around the intersection while the drivers kept the engines running, transmissions in gear, ready for immediate extraction. The plan called for the prisoners to be loaded into cargo nets, hoisted by Blackhawks if the street proved too contested for ground movement. But as the minutes ticked by and no prisoners emerged from the building, the convoy commander began to suspect the mission profile was changing. The street was coming alive, not with organized resistance, not yet, but with the kind of ambient hostility that preceded it, faces appearing in windows and doorways, then disappearing, children running between buildings carrying messages, the sound of metal on metal as weapons were loaded and charged in the alleys beyond the Rangers' line of sight. The Somali militiamen had learned to read the signs of an American raid. The helicopters, the blocking positions, the dust clouds kicked up by the convoy. They knew how to respond, how to mass fighters in the blind spots, how to turn the narrow streets into kill zones where superior firepower meant less than it did in open terrain. But there was something else happening too, something the Rangers couldn't quite articulate but felt in their bones. The civilians were leaving, not running, not fleeing in panic, but withdrawing with deliberate purpose, mothers pulling children by the hand, old men moving as quickly as their legs would allow, shopkeepers closing their stalls and rolling down corrugated metal shutters, even though it was still mid-afternoon, hours before the normal close of business. One of the Rangers, Specialist Dale Sizemore, watched an elderly woman in a black hijab stop at the edge of the intersection, look directly at him, and shake her head slowly, mouthing words he couldn't hear over the sound of the helicopters. Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a small cloth bag that sat in the dust, undisturbed by the rotor wash. Sergeant Eversman, who had taken up position near the convoy, noticed the bag. Standard operating procedure dictated treating any unattended object as a potential IED, improvised explosive device. But something about the way the woman had placed it, the care with which she had set it down, suggested it wasn't meant as a weapon. He radioed for one of the Rangers with EOD training to check it out, and after a tense 2 minutes of visual inspection and a gentle prod with a rifle barrel, the bag was opened. Inside, salt, a small glass vial of oil, and a folded piece of paper covered in Arabic script. The translator attached to the convoy, a Lebanese-American specialist named Karim Azam, was called forward. He unfolded the paper, read it in silence, then read it again. When Eversman asked what it said, Azam hesitated before answering. It was a prayer, he explained, or something like a prayer. A verse from the Quran meant to ward off jinn, followed by instructions written in a different hand, more hurried, less formal. The instructions said, "Leave this place before dark. The Malaikatu al-Soda have come. They take the soul before the body knows it is gone." Eversman asked what that meant, and Azam told him the direct translation, Black Angels, but added that it wasn't a term he recognized from Islamic theology. He had heard it once before from his grandmother, who had been born in southern Lebanon near the ancient city of Sidon. She had used it to describe something that appeared during the Civil War in the 1970s, a presence that was seen in the ruins of bombed-out buildings where many had died. People who went into those buildings sometimes didn't come out, and the ones who did come out were never quite right afterward. They spoke of cold, of shadows that moved against the light, of a feeling like being watched by something that had no eyes. Eversman didn't know what to do with that information. He was a ranger, a staff sergeant, trained in small unit tactics and direct action. Folklore and superstition were not part of his skill set, but he also wasn't stupid, and he had been in Mogadishu long enough to know that the Somalis didn't scare easily. If they were abandoning the market, if an old woman was leaving protective charms in the street, then something had changed, something beyond the usual calculus of risk and reward that governed militia movements. He keyed his radio, called up to the command bird. "We've got civilians clearing out of the area. Fast. Recommend we expedite exfil." The response came back from Lieutenant Colonel Tom Matthews, the ground force commander circling in one of the C-2 Blackhawks. "Copy your concern. Delta's still clearing the building. Stand by." Inside the target building, the Delta operators had reached the same conclusion. The mission was compromised, not by enemy action, but by whatever had killed the men on the second and third floors. The team leader, whose call sign was Juliet 64, made the decision to abort the sweep and extract with whatever intelligence could be gathered from the bodies. Two of the operators began photographing the scene with 35mm cameras loaded with high-speed film, documenting the positions of the deceased, the arrangement of the room, the details that might matter later when someone tried to make sense of this. Another operator collected the open Quran, the glass of cold tea, a notebook that had been lying near one of the bodies, its pages filled with handwritten Somali that would later be translated and classified. But as they worked, the cold continued to deepen. The temperature in the third-floor room had dropped to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading that one of the operators confirmed with a digital thermometer clipped to his vest. Breath fog hung in the air like mist. Frost was beginning to form on the metal support pillars, thin crystalline patterns that spread upward from the floor, as if the cold was rising from somewhere beneath the building. And the smell, burnt metal, ozone, and now something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left in a freezer too long. One of the operators, the same master sergeant who had reported the initial temperature drop, aimed his flashlight at the floor and saw something that made him stop moving. Shadows. But not the shadows cast by their bodies or the support pillars. These were different, darker, with edges that seemed too sharp, too defined, and they were moving independently, sliding across the concrete in directions that didn't correspond to any light source. He didn't say anything at first. He watched, and as he watched, one of the shadows pooled beneath the nearest body, then rose slowly vertically, standing upright like a figure made of ink. He keyed his radio, his voice tight but controlled. "Juliet 64, we need to leave. Now." The team leader turned, saw what the master sergeant was looking at, and for 3 full seconds, an eternity in tactical time, he did not move, did not speak, because his training had not prepared him for this, because there was no protocol, no doctrine, no manual that explained what to do when the shadows started standing up. He gave the order. "Exfil all elements. Collapse to ground floor. We're leaving." The Delta operators emerged from the target building at 15:56 hours, moving in a tight formation toward the waiting convoy. The street had transformed in the minutes they had been inside. What had been an empty intersection ringed by nervous rangers was now a contested space, rounds snapping overhead from rooftops and alleyways, the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire mixing with the deeper reports of RPK light machine guns. The militia was massing, converging on the American position with a speed that suggested coordination, communication, intent. This was no longer a surgical raid. It was becoming a battle. The little birds dove low, their miniguns raking the rooftops, brass casings raining down onto the street below like metal hail. The sound was apocalyptic, a sustained mechanical scream that drowned out everything else, and for 30 seconds the incoming fire slackened as the militiamen dove for cover. The Rangers used the pause to tighten their perimeter, repositioning behind vehicle hulks and concrete barriers, their M16 and M249 squad automatic weapons trained on the alleyways where movement flickered in the shadows. But the shadows were wrong. Specialist Sizemore saw it first. He was covering the southern approach, a narrow alley choked with trash and abandoned market stalls. His weapon rested on a low wall, his finger indexed along the receiver, ready but not yet firing. The alley was maybe 40 meters deep, ending in a T-junction where two buildings met. He could see figures moving at the far end, militia fighters taking positions, but between him and them, in the middle distance where the sunlight didn't quite reach, there was something else. A shape. Vertical, humanoid, but without definition, without texture, as if someone had cut a hole in the air itself, and the hole was standing upright. He blinked, wiped sweat from his eyes, looked again. Still there. And it was moving toward him, not walking but gliding, covering ground without any visible motion of limbs. The temperature around him dropped so suddenly that he gasped, his breath fogging in front of his face, and the hairs on his arms stood up beneath his uniform sleeves, every nerve in his body screaming that he was in the presence of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. He squeezed the trigger. A 3-round burst, center mass, exactly as he had been trained. The rounds passed through the shape without resistance, without impact, sparking off the concrete wall behind it. He fired again, a longer burst, and the result was the same. The shape continued forward, and now Sizemore could feel it, a pressure against his chest like a hand pressing down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. His vision started to tunnel, the edges going gray, and he heard a sound that wasn't a sound, a vibration that came from inside his skull, low and resonant and utterly alien. Sergeant Eversman saw Sizemore stagger backward, saw him drop to one knee, his weapon falling to hang from its sling, his hands going to his throat as if he was choking. Eversman moved without thinking, covering the distance in 4 long strides, grabbing Sizemore by the drag handle on his body armor and pulling him back, away from the alley, away from whatever the hell was in there. As soon as they crossed the threshold into full sunlight, Sizemore gasped, sucking in air, his eyes wide and unfocused. "What happened?" Eversman demanded, still scanning the alley, his rifle raised, but he couldn't see what Sizemore had seen. The alley looked empty now, just shadows and trash and the distant shapes of militia fighters who were starting to advance again, emboldened by the lull in fire. Sizemore couldn't answer. He was shaking, his skin pale beneath the dust and sweat, and when Eversman looked into his eyes, he saw something he had never seen before in a ranger. Raw, primal terror. The radio net erupted with similar reports. Rangers at the western perimeter reported movement in the shadows that didn't match any human profile, shapes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, cold zones that appeared without explanation in the middle of the 100-degree afternoon. One ranger fired an entire magazine into a doorway where he swore he saw something standing, something that watched him with an awareness that felt malicious, predatory. When other rangers moved to check the doorway, they found nothing but spent brass and bullet holes in empty walls. The Delta operators, now loaded into the convoy vehicles, reported the same phenomena. Temperature drops, visual anomalies, a pervasive sense of being observed by something that existed just outside the normal spectrum of perception. The master sergeant who had seen the shadows rise in the third floor room told the team leader, in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper, that they had woken something up, that the bodies in the building had been a warning, not a target, that the Somalis had known, and that was why they had fled. At 16:03 hours, the convoy attempted to move. The lead Humvee, carrying Lieutenant Colonel Matthews and the command element, rolled forward 10 meters before the driver slammed on the brakes. The street ahead was blocked, not by a physical barrier, but by a wall of cold air so dense it was visible, a shimmer like heat distortion but inverted, a vertical plane of frigid atmosphere that extended from one side of the street to the other. Matthews ordered the driver to push through it, and the Humvee accelerated, engine roaring, but as the vehicle crossed the threshold, every electrical system died. The radio, the GPS, the engine itself, all silent. The Humvee coasted to a stop in the middle of the intersection, dead in the water. The militiamen saw the vulnerability and attacked. RPG rounds streaked across the street, impacting against buildings and vehicles, filling the air with smoke and fragmentation. The Rangers returned fire, their discipline holding despite the chaos, controlled bursts aimed at muzzle flashes and moving silhouettes. One of the little birds swept in low, its minigun shredding a rooftop where an RPG team had been setting up, the bodies tumbling off the edge in pieces. But the cold was spreading. It radiated from the target building like a pulse, a wave of sub-zero air that moved against the natural order of things, against the physics of a city baking under equatorial sun. Frost formed on metal surfaces, rifle barrels, vehicle doors, the buckles of load-bearing vests. The Rangers' breath fogged. Their fingers went numb inside their gloves. And in the buildings around them, in the doorways and windows and the deep shadows of the alleys, the shapes were gathering. They didn't move like soldiers. They didn't move like anything alive. They stood motionless in the darkness, watching, waiting, and the longer the Americans remained in the intersection, the more of them appeared, manifesting out of the shadows as if the shadows themselves were giving birth to them. The Delta operators, hardened men who had seen combat in Panama and the Persian Gulf, who had trained for every conceivable contingency, found themselves doing something they had never done before. They stopped looking at the militia fighters and started looking at the shadows, because the shadows were the real threat, and everyone knew it, even if no one could say it out loud. At 16:08 hours, the first Black Hawk was hit. Super 6-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Wolcott, took an RPG round to the tail rotor assembly while orbiting over the target area. The aircraft shuddered, yawed hard to the right, and began to spiral. Wolcott fought the controls, trying to auto-rotate, trying to find a clear space to put the bird down, but Mogadishu offered no clear spaces, only rooftops and alleys and streets packed with rubble. The Black Hawk descended in a grinding, screaming arc, clipping a building with its main rotor, the blades disintegrating in a spray of composite shards, and then it hit the street 2 blocks east of the target building, the impact crushing the landing gear and folding the fuselage like aluminum foil. The crash site became an immediate focal point. Every Ranger, every Delta operator, every pilot in the air knew the protocol. No man left behind. The ground convoy would have to reach Super 6-1, extract the crew and any survivors, and hold the position until a rescue bird could arrive. But between the convoy and the crash site were 2 blocks of hostile territory, hundreds of armed militia fighters, and something else, something that was making the air itself a weapon, turning the temperature into a variable that defied all logic. And in the target building, on the 3rd floor, where the bodies sat in their circle, the shadows had stopped moving. They stood in formation now, perfectly still, as if waiting for a signal, as if waiting for permission. The sun was descending toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Mogadishu, and as the light changed, so did the nature of the battle. The militia fighters were no longer simply attacking, they were herding, pushing the American forces into specific areas, away from certain streets, away from certain buildings. The pattern was subtle at first, but the Delta operators recognized it because they used the same tactic themselves, manipulating an enemy's movement by controlling their options, funneling them into kill zones. Except the Somalis weren't pushing them toward ambush points, they were pushing them away from the shadows. The ground convoy split. Half the force remained at the original target building, maintaining the perimeter, while the rest fought their way toward the Super 6-1 crash site 2 blocks east. The urban terrain made every meter a negotiation of violence, buildings overlooking the streets, alleyways offering concealment to militia fighters who would fire and displace before the Rangers could return effective fire. Civilians still mixed in with the combatants, making target identification a constant calculus of risk and rules of engagement. Staff Sergeant Eversman led his chalk toward the crash site on foot, moving in bounding overwatch, one fire team providing cover while the other advanced. The heat was still oppressive despite the hour, but the cold zones persisted, pockets of frigid air that appeared without warning, sometimes lasting only seconds, sometimes longer. One ranger stepped through what appeared to be empty doorway and stopped mid-stride, his body going rigid, his weapon clattering to the ground. The ranger behind him grabbed his webbing and pulled him back, and the man collapsed, unconscious, his skin gray, his pulse weak and irregular. The medic checked his core temperature, 89 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia, in Mogadishu, in October. At the crash site, the scene was worse than anyone had anticipated. The Black Hawk had come to rest on its side, the cockpit crushed, the cabin torn open, rotor blades scattered across the street like the bones of some massive predator. Chief Warrant Officer Wolcott was dead, killed on impact. His co-pilot was critically injured, trapped in the wreckage, and the crew chiefs in the back were working desperately to free him while taking fire from 3 directions. The Delta operators who reached the site first established a defensive perimeter, but it was tenuous, a thin line of maybe 20 men holding against hundreds of militia fighters who were converging on the position with suicidal determination. And then the sun touched the horizon. The change was immediate. The shadows that had been anomalous, strange but limited, suddenly multiplied. They poured out of the buildings like liquid, flowing down walls, spreading across the street, coalescing into forms that were no longer just vertical shapes, but something more defined, more intentional. They had mass now, or the appearance of mass, and they moved with purpose, circling the crash site, the target building, the convoy positions, creating a perimeter within the perimeter. The temperature plummeted. Within 5 minutes, it dropped from 94 degrees to 68 degrees, and it was still falling. The Rangers and Delta operators found themselves fighting on 2 fronts. The militia continued to attack from the buildings and alleyways, and the Americans returned fire, calling in little bird gun runs that chewed through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. But the shadows were the greater threat. They didn't attack in any conventional sense. They simply moved closer, and anyone who came into contact with them, anyone who was touched by the darkness that wasn't quite darkness, went down as if they had been struck by an invisible weapon. Specialist John Stebbins was the first confirmed casualty of the shadow contact. He was providing security on the northern approach to the crash site, firing controlled bursts at militia fighters moving between buildings, when one of the shapes moved up behind him. He didn't see it, didn't hear it, but the ranger next to him did, and he screamed a warning that came too late. The shape enveloped Stebbins for perhaps 2 seconds, and when it receded, when it flowed back into the mass of darkness that surrounded the position, Stebbins was on the ground, his weapon beside him, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The medic reached him within seconds, checked for vitals, and found a pulse, faint but present. But Stebbins didn't respond to verbal commands, didn't respond to pain stimuli. His skin was cold, his pupils fixed and dilated, and when they pulled him back into the casualty collection point, he began to convulse, his body racked by tremors that shouldn't have been possible given the temperature of his skin. The master sergeant from the Delta assault team, the one who had seen the shadows rise in the target building, grabbed the unit's only satellite radio and contacted the Joint Operations Center back at the airfield. He spoke quickly, efficiently, laying out what was happening in terms that would sound insane to anyone who hadn't been there, but he didn't care about how it sounded because men were dying and the situation was deteriorating faster than any tactical response could address. We have hostile contact of an unknown nature, non-ballistic threat, environmental and physiological effects consistent with extreme cold exposure despite ambient temperature of 90+ degrees. Request immediate exfil for all personnel. Danger close air support authorized, and advise higher command that this is not a conventional combat situation. The response from the JOC was silence, then a different voice, older, carrying the weight of rank. Say again your last. You're reporting non-ballistic contact? Affirmative. We have personnel down from exposure to an unidentified phenomenon. Recommend full withdrawal from Bakara Market before dark. The Somalis know about this. That's why they cleared out. Another pause. Stand by. But there was no time to stand by. At the target building, where half the force was still holding position, the shadows had begun to enter the structure. They flowed through the doorways and windows, moving upward through the building like smoke in reverse, and the Rangers inside found themselves retreating to the roof, driven by an instinct older than training, older than doctrine. On the roof, under the open sky, they could still fight the militia, but inside, in the corridors and rooms where the shadows gathered, the cold was absolute, and the feeling of being watched had transformed into something worse, the feeling of being hunted. Super 6-4, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant, was orbiting the target area at low altitude, providing aerial observation and fire support when his Black Hawk was struck by a second RPG. The round hit the tail section, severing the tail rotor drive shaft, and the aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin. Durant fought it, managing to slow the descent enough that the impact, when it came, was survivable. But the crash site was over a mile from the American positions, deep in militia-controlled territory, completely isolated. The command net erupted with overlapping transmissions. 2 Black Hawks down. Ground forces split between 3 separate positions. Ammunition running low. Casualties mounting. And night falling over Mogadishu like a curtain, bringing with it a darkness that was more than the absence of light. At the Super 6-1 crash site, the Delta operators made a decision that would haunt some of them for the rest of their lives. They couldn't hold the position through the night, they couldn't extract the dead or recover all the equipment, and they couldn't fight what was coming out of the shadows. So they consolidated the survivors, set thermite grenades on the sensitive equipment, and began a fighting withdrawal back toward the original target building where the rest of the force was gathering for a last stand. As they moved through the streets, bounding from cover to cover under fire from militia fighters who seemed determined to drive them in a specific direction, the shadows followed. They didn't chase, they herded. And the Rangers and Delta operators, hardened professionals who had been trained to never give ground, found themselves retreating, not from an enemy they could see, but from a presence that defied every category of threat they had been taught to recognize. The shapes were fully formed now, visible even to those who had been skeptical, and they numbered in the dozens, perhaps hundreds, standing in formation in the streets and buildings, watching the Americans with an attention that felt deliberate, calculating. They didn't attack en masse, they waited, and as the temperature continued to drop, as frost formed on concrete walls and rifle barrels became too cold to touch with bare hands, the men of Task Force Ranger understood with a certainty that transcended logic that they were not in control of this situation, had never been in control, and that whatever these things were, they had been waiting for this moment for this convergence of violence and death and desecration to manifest fully into the world. At 18:47 hours, with darkness complete and the sounds of battle echoing across the city, the remaining American forces consolidated at the target building. 73 men, surrounded on all sides by militia fighters and something worse, with ammunition running low, water almost gone, and no clear path of extraction. The Rangers set claymore mines at the approaches, positioned machine guns to cover the alleys, and prepared to hold until relief could arrive. But relief was 12 hours away, and the night had just begun. The relief column arrived at 0543 hours on October 4th, 19 hours after the mission had begun. It consisted of elements from the 10th Mountain Division, Pakistani tanks, and Malaysian armored personnel carriers. A multinational force cobbled together with desperate speed because the Rangers and Delta operators trapped in Bakara Market were running out of everything: ammunition, water, medical supplies, and time. The column fought its way through contested streets, taking casualties from RPG fire and small arms ambushes. But by the time they reached the target building, the heaviest resistance had already faded. The militia fighters had withdrawn during the night, pulled back to their strongholds, and the streets were empty except for the bodies and the debris and the cold. The cold remained even after sunrise. The temperature at the target building, measured by the first officers to enter, read 54 degrees Fahrenheit in rooms that should have been warming under the morning sun. Frost still clung to the walls in patterns that didn't match any known meteorological phenomenon. Geometric shapes, almost like script, as if something had written on the concrete in ice. The medics who entered found 71 survivors in various states of shock, hypothermia, and exhaustion. 2 men were dead from gunshot wounds. 3 more were unresponsive, their vital signs present but neurologically absent, staring at nothing with eyes that didn't track movement or respond to light. Specialist Sizemore was among the unresponsive. He had collapsed during the night, during one of the periods when the shadows had pressed closest to the building. And despite aggressive warming and 4 fluids, he remained catatonic. His core temperature had stabilized at 95 degrees, but his pupils were fixed, his breathing shallow, and when the neurologist at the field hospital examined him later that day, she would find no physical explanation for his condition. No trauma, no infection, no toxicological cause. He was simply gone, his body still functioning, but his consciousness absent, as if something had reached inside and pulled out whatever made him who he was. The bodies from the 3rd floor of the target building were photographed, documented, and removed by a specialized team wearing full protective equipment, not because anyone thought the deaths were caused by biological or chemical agents, but because no one knew what had caused them, and uncertainty bred caution. The autopsies, conducted at Ramstein Air Base in Germany 2 days later, revealed physiological impossibilities. The tissues showed signs of extreme cold exposure, ice crystal formation in the cellular structures, necrosis consistent with frostbite. But the bodies had been found in a room where the ambient temperature had never dropped below 90 degrees until the Americans arrived. The cause of death was listed after considerable debate as undetermined physiological failure secondary to environmental exposure of unknown origin. The official after-action report filed by Joint Special Operations Command made no mention of shadows, manifestations, or anomalous phenomena. It documented the mission as a tactical success that became complicated by the loss of 2 helicopters and the subsequent urban combat that lasted through the night. 18 Americans died. 73 were wounded. Somali casualties were estimated between 300 and 500, though the exact number would never be confirmed. The report noted unusual environmental conditions, localized temperature variations, electronic equipment failures, disorientation among personnel, but attributed these to the stress of prolonged combat, equipment malfunction, and the psychological effects of operating in an extreme urban environment. But there was another report, one that circulated among a much smaller audience. It was compiled by a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who had been tasked with debriefing the returning operators, and it included testimony that didn't fit the official narrative. 27 separate accounts of visual anomalies, 14 reports of paralysis or unconsciousness following contact with undefined shapes in low-light conditions, meteorological data from overhead surveillance assets showing thermal anomalies that moved independently of wind patterns or building structures, and a single piece of radio intercept captured by NSA assets monitoring Somali communications, in which a militia commander was heard saying, in Arabic, "We did not drive them out. The Mala'ikatu al-Sauda did. We only finished what they started." The DIA report concluded with a recommendation: no further operations in Bakara Market after dark, no insertion of personnel into buildings where mass casualties had occurred without cause, and a request for cultural and anthropological expertise on pre-Islamic and Islamic beliefs regarding spiritual entities, specifically in the context of East African warfare and death rituals. The report was classified top secret, distribution limited to fewer than 30 individuals, and within 2 weeks, the operation in Mogadishu was over. Task Force Ranger was withdrawn. The United Nations mission was scaled back, and Bakara Market returned to the control of the warlords. In the months that followed, 3 of the men who had been inside the target building died under circumstances that defied medical explanation. One suffered a cardiac arrest despite having no history of heart disease and no detectable cause on autopsy. Another died in his sleep, his body found frozen in a locked room where the thermostat read 72 degrees. The third simply stopped breathing while sitting in his car at a stoplight in North Carolina, his face calm, his eyes open, as if he had seen something that made him decide it was time to leave. The survivors didn't talk about what they had seen, not to the press, not to their families, and not to each other. There was an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding that some experiences existed outside the framework of language, and that trying to articulate them would only invite disbelief or worse, the kind of scrutiny that ends careers and destroys credibility. But in private moments, in the spaces between official duties and public appearances, some of them would admit to feeling watched, to sensing a presence that lingered at the edge of perception, to waking in the night with the certainty that something had been standing at the foot of their bed, waiting. Specialist Sizemore never regained consciousness. He was medically retired, his care transferred to a VA facility in Virginia, where he remained in a persistent vegetative state for 7 years before his heart finally stopped. His family never understood what had happened to him. The Army couldn't explain it, and the doctors who examined him in those final years noted in their private consultations that his body temperature remained consistently lower than normal, 94.6 degrees Fahrenheit, day and night, year after year, as if something had reached inside him and turned down the heat that keeps a human being alive. The target building in Bakara Market was demolished in 1995 during a brief period of relative peace. The demolition crew reported strange occurrences, equipment failures, unexplained cold spots, workers who refused to enter certain sections of the structure. The foreman, a Somali engineer who had studied in Italy, told a journalist that the building had been cursed, that too many had died there without proper burial rites, and that the Mala'ikatu al-Sauda had claimed it as their own. The demolition was completed, but even now, more than 2 decades later, the locals avoid the site. No one builds there, no one lingers. And on certain nights, when the wind comes in from the ocean and the city grows quiet, people say you can still feel the cold rising from the ground where the building once stood. The footage from the helmet cameras and surveillance assets was classified and stored in a facility in Maryland. Most of it has never been reviewed. The few analysts who did examine it reported nothing unusual. Standard urban combat, thermal signatures consistent with human targets, audio that matched the expected sounds of a firefight. But there were gaps, moments where the video distorted, where the audio dropped to subsonic frequencies that shouldn't have been audible, where shadows appeared on film in ways that defied the available light sources. These anomalies were noted, cataloged, and filed away, and no one was authorized to investigate further. In Somalia, the story of October 3rd became legend. The elders speak of it still, of the day the Americans came and the Malaikatu al-Sauda rose to meet them, of the battle that raged through the night while forces older than nations watched and waited and ultimately claimed their due. The younger generation dismisses it as superstition, as the kind of story old men tell to make sense of chaos. But the market women still leave offerings of salt at certain intersections. The children still refuse to play near the old demolition site. And the militiamen, when they speak of that day, speak not of victory, but of survival. Not against the Americans, but against something else, something that reminded them that there are powers in the world that exist beyond guns and politics and the reach of any government. The official narrative of the Battle of Mogadishu was written within 72 hours of the last helicopter lifting off from the airfield. It was a story of tactical miscalculation, heroic resistance, and ultimate extraction under fire. The deaths were attributed to enemy action, the casualties to the expected friction of urban combat. The media coverage focused on the bravery of the Rangers and Delta operators, on the failure of intelligence to anticipate the militia's response, on the political ramifications of American involvement in a foreign civil war. And that narrative held. It became history. It was turned into books, films, documentaries, each one reinforcing the official version until the unofficial version, the one that included shadows and cold and men who stopped breathing for reasons no doctor could explain, was buried so deep that even most of the participants began to doubt their own memories. But there were always those who remembered, those who couldn't forget. In 1998, a former Delta operator named Thomas Michaels, not his real name, which remains classified, walked into the office of a civilian anthropologist at Georgetown University. Michaels had been present in the target building, had been part of the team that found the bodies on the third floor, and he had spent 5 years trying to make sense of what he had experienced. He brought with him a collection of materials, photocopies of incident reports that had been sanitized before official filing, personal journals written during his deployment, and a small cloth bag that he said had been given to him by a Somali interpreter in the days after the battle. Inside the bag was salt, dried herbs, and a piece of paper covered in Arabic script. The anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Kincaid, specialized in belief systems in conflict zones. She had done fieldwork in Lebanon, Bosnia, and Rwanda, documenting how cultures understood and processed mass violence through religious and folkloric frameworks. When Michaels described what he had seen in Mogadishu, she didn't dismiss him. She listened. And then she began to research. What she found was a pattern. The concept of the Malaikatu al-Sauda appeared in fragmentary references across centuries of Islamic and pre-Islamic sources from the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of North Africa. They were not angels in the theological sense, but something older, something that predated organized religion and had been absorbed into Islamic cosmology as a category of jinn, specifically a subclass of entities that appeared in places where the boundary between life and death had been violated through mass killing, improper burial, or desecration of remains. They were described as cold, as shadow, as presences that fed on the residue of violent death and manifested most strongly after sunset in places where many had died without proper ritual care. The earliest written reference Dr. Kincaid found was in a 10th century manuscript from Baghdad describing an incident during the Abbasid Caliphate when soldiers entered a village that had been wiped out by plague. The bodies had been left unburied for weeks, and when the soldiers arrived at dusk, they reported seeing figures made of darkness moving among the corpses. By morning, half the soldiers were dead, their bodies showing no wounds but exhibiting signs of extreme cold exposure despite the desert heat. The chronicler wrote that the soldiers had disturbed the Mala'ikatu al-Sauda and that the darkness had claimed its price. Similar accounts appeared in scattered sources: Ottoman records from the Balkan Wars, British colonial reports from Sudan, French military documents from Algeria. Each one described the same phenomenon: unexplained deaths following combat in areas where bodies had not been properly handled, accompanied by cold, shadow, and a sense of malevolent observation. The reports were always relegated to footnotes, dismissed as superstition, or attributed to disease, heat stroke, or psychological breakdown. But the pattern persisted across cultures, across centuries, suggesting that whatever was being described was real in some sense, even if it didn't fit within the accepted categories of reality. Dr. Kincaid compiled her findings into a paper titled Liminal Entities and Post-Combat Trauma, a cross-cultural analysis of supernatural attribution in conflict zones. She submitted it to several academic journals, all of which rejected it as too speculative, too reliant on anecdotal evidence, too willing to entertain non-materialist explanations. She tried presenting it at conferences, where it was received with polite skepticism by most and outright hostility by some. The few who took her seriously were anthropologists who had done their own fieldwork in war zones and had encountered similar stories, similar patterns, but lacked the institutional support or the courage to pursue them. Then in 2001, Dr. Kincaid received a visit from two men in civilian clothes who identified themselves as consultants for the Department of Defense. They asked her about her research, about the sources she had used, about Thomas Michaels and what he had told her. They were polite, professional, and very clear. The paper could not be published. The research could not continue. And any materials related to the Mogadishu incident specifically needed to be turned over to them for reasons of national security. She complied. She had no choice. But before she handed over her files, she made copies. And those copies found their way into private collections, into the hands of researchers who operated outside official channels, into the kind of archives that exist in the gray spaces between academic inquiry and classified operations. Thomas Michaels died in 2003 in a car accident on a clear day on a straight road in Virginia. The official cause was driver error. He had apparently swerved off the road and into a tree at high speed, but the police report noted that his vehicle's internal temperature at the time of discovery was measured at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the ambient temperature being 79 degrees and the vehicle having been sitting in direct sunlight for an estimated 2 hours before discovery. The air conditioning had not been running. There was no mechanical explanation for the cold. The Department of Defense does not officially recognize the existence of anomalous phenomena in combat zones. The position, articulated in countless briefings and policy documents, is that all reported incidents can be explained through conventional means: equipment failure, environmental factors, psychological stress, enemy action. There is no category in military doctrine for entities that cannot be engaged with conventional weapons, no protocol for withdrawing from territory because the shadows are standing up, but unofficially, among those who have access to the right files, there is an understanding. Certain locations are flagged in operational databases with codes that translate, for those who know, as high strangeness potential. Operations in these areas are planned with additional contingencies, with extraction routes that prioritize speed over tactical advantage, with standing orders to avoid certain types of buildings, specifically those where mass casualties have occurred and where local populations report unusual activity. And personnel who report experiences that fall outside standard parameters are quietly reassigned, their accounts filed in databases that exist parallel to official records, accessible only to analysts, whose job is to watch for patterns that shouldn't exist but do. There are currently 47 known locations worldwide that carry this designation. Mogadishu is one. The others are scattered across conflict zones in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. The patterns are consistent: combat operations in areas with high civilian casualties, improper handling of remains, violations of local burial customs, followed by environmental anomalies, unexplained casualties, and reports of phenomena that match almost exactly the historical descriptions of the Mala'ikatu al-Sauda. The military doesn't call them that. The designation in the database is Category 4, Environmental Hazard, Non-Standard. But the men and women who have encountered them, who have felt the cold and seen the shadows and watched their teammates go down without a shot being fired, they have their own names. Black Angels, Shadow Walkers, the things that wait in the dark, and they share their stories quietly, in bars off base, and in online forums that require verification of service records to access, because they need to know they're not alone, that what they experienced was real, even if the official world will never acknowledge it. In Somalia, the elders still tell the story. They sit in the shade of acacia trees and speak of the day the foreigners came and learned what the Somalis had always known: that there are forces in the world older than empires, older than weapons, older than the divisions that make men kill each other. They speak of the Mala'ikatu al-Sauda as fact, not metaphor, and they teach their children the old protections: salt, prayer, respect for the dead, and the understanding that some places, once marked by violence, are never truly free of it. The target building is gone, but the ground remains. And on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the city grows quiet, the temperature drops in that empty lot. The locals measure it. They've recorded it on thermometers, documented it on video, not for proof. They don't need proof, but as a reminder that the world is larger than what can be seen in daylight, that the boundaries between the living and the dead are thinner than most people believe, and that there are consequences for the kind of violence that modern warfare treats as routine. The official archives will never reflect this. The history books will tell the story of brave soldiers and tactical errors and political decisions made in capitals far from the fighting. But in the spaces between the official narrative and the lived experience of those who were there, the truth persists. It persists in the DIA files that will remain classified for another 75 years. It persists in the medical records of men who died without cause. It persists in the memories of operators who wake in the night feeling watched, feeling cold, knowing that something followed them home from Mogadishu and has never quite let go. And it persists in the shadows themselves, in the dark places where the dead are not at rest, where the balance has been broken and something waits to collect the debt. The Mala'ikatu al-Sauda are patient. They have existed for centuries. They will exist for centuries more. And they will be there in the places where war strips away the pretense of civilization and exposes the raw truth beneath, waiting for the next time the living forget that the dead demand respect, waiting for the next time someone enters their domain without permission, waiting for the next time someone turns their back on the shadows.